Hello, and welcome to the first of our webinar series that focuses on the topic of grief. This webinar is sponsored by Spiritual Unique, the premier resource for information relating to spiritual and emotional wellness. My name is Dr. Zenobia Fennell, and I will be the narrator for our series today. So, once again, thank you for joining us, and let's get started. Most of the information that you see in this webinar will be taken from two primary sources. One written by Melissa Kelly, Grief, Contemporary Theory and the Practice of Ministry. The other by Kenneth Doka and Terry L. Martin, Grieving Beyond Gender, Understanding the Ways Men and Women Mourn. All of these authors are contemporary voices on the topic of grief and can give us much information about today's theories relating to grief and loss. Throughout the presentation, I will be referring to Melissa Kelly as simply Kelly, and Kenneth Doka and Terry Martin as Doka Martin. Our objectives today are to define grief, bereavement, and mourning, and to briefly discuss responses that we typically see for those who are experiencing some type of loss. So, how do we actually define grief? Well, grief is about loss, and it's about any kind of loss that we can experience. So, we're going to define grief as being of or ceasing to have something that one formerly possessed or to which one was attached. So, grief is not just about death, it's about any kind of loss that you can experience. We have some listed here. There's material loss, where there's an actual loss of something material, such as a prized possession or one's childhood home. There's role loss, such as that of a competent manager after retirement, or that of a spouse after a divorce. And then there's relationship loss, the loss of a particular way of relating with one another, or the loss of a significant other, even the loss of a colleague after a job layoff, or one's parents who is in some type of physical or mental decline. And then there's systemic loss, loss in an entire group or system experiences, such as what city dwellers may experience when an important landmark is torn down, or what an office staff experiences when a colleague moves. And then there's functional loss. It's the loss of mobility following a paralyzing accident or the slow deterioration of one's vision as one ages. And then there's intrapsychic loss. And this is a loss within one's own psyche. The loss that says, wow, I can never obtain that dream, or it's too late for me. It's about one's future, the world, and the painful recognition of one's own limitations. And then there is chronic sorrow. These are losses that are ongoing. This concept was first introduced by rehabilitation counselor Simon Olshansky to describe the grief of parents of a child diagnosed with a serious developmental disability, such as mental retardation. The loss constituted the loss of their fantasy of how their child would be and what parenting would be like. This is another type of a living loss. What is central to chronic sorrow is the role of fantasy, what could have been or should have been. And then there's living loss, and some examples of this are family members of those with mental illness, loss of a freer life without the constant strain of worrying and caregiving. And the same with elderly parents who are living but don't have the mental or physical capabilities that they once did. And then there's developmental losses. These are losses that result really is a part of being mature or maturation and continued development. And these losses usually bring about some kind of gain as well as loss. Like there's a birth of a baby, but there's a loss of your, personal time. And getting married is another example. There's a loss of independence, even though you've gained a spouse and intimacy. And so there's also situational losses. And these are less often seen as beneficial and are usually anticipated with anxiety. For example, a physical loss, the loss of something tangible that is no longer present, like there was a robbery that took place or destruction of something that was very important to you. So, how do we define bereavement? Now, this is something that many people use interchangeably with grief, but the literature suggests that there is a difference. So let's look at that. So bereavement, we're going to define, and this is taken from the Kelly book, the state of being deprived of someone by death. So grief, it's about any kind of loss, but bereavement is specifically associated with death. And then there's a definition of mourning. Again, many people use these phrases interchangeably, and some define mourning as the culturally patterned expression or rituals that accompany loss and allows others to recognize that one has become bereaved. And that's from our Doka Martin book. So for an example of that is when a person actually attends a funeral and is wearing black, which is the ritual, and they wear armbands as a symbol of solidarity with a deceased person. These are all mourning behaviors. Now, Melissa Kelly uses mourning and grief interchangeably, and you can, as both refer to one how responds to loss, but Doka and Martin reviews the work of Teresa Rando, another contemporary voice on the topic of grief. And her definition is becoming increasingly accepted in the field. So according to Doka and Martin, Rando, who built on Sigmund Freud's definition of mourning, which was a psychological process that occurs as individuals experience loss, reorient their relationships to the deceased, their own sense of self, and their external world. Now that's Sigmund Freud's definition. Now Rando built upon that a little bit. So how did she do that exactly? Well, let's see. Now, according to Doka Martin, Rando offers a model of mourning that identifies three phases of grieving: the avoidance phase, confrontation phase, and the accommodation phase. And Rando's model is called the 6R mourning process. And let's see what that is about. In the avoidance phase is where you have the first of the R's in the 6R process. Notice that recognizing begins with an R, as do all of the parts of the process. So recognizing the loss involves acknowledging and understanding the death. You're just trying to make sense of it all. In the confrontation phase, you have the next three R's. Reacting to the separation, which includes experiencing the pain, expressing the psychological reactions to the loss, and identifying and mourning secondary losses. There's recollecting and experiencing the deceased in the relationship, which includes cognitive and affective dimensions, which means you are thinking about the person or you are expressing that loss, whether it be emotionally or physically. And then there's relinquishing the old attachments to the deceased and the old assumptive world. And we're going to talk about attachments and what an assumptive world is. But basically what we're doing is we are moving forward and finding ways to put our old lives behind us and those those attachments that we once had with a deceased, and we're finding ways to move forward. And finally, there's the accommodation phase where we are readjusting to move adaptively into the new world without forgetting the old and reinvesting in new relationships. Now, there are others, according to Doka Martin, who have definitions of mourning, such as the dual process model offered by Strobe and Schutt, or Gordon, who focuses on tasks individuals must complete during the grief process. Overall, most contemporary voices on grief express the need for there to be a period of acknowledging the loss, trying to make meaning of the loss, and how to move forward after the loss has been processed. So, Kelly shares with us some important things that we need to remember when it comes to the way people respond to grief. We have to remember that grief is different for different people. People respond differently to grief, and it is particularly complex, intricate, and multidimensional. So, one of the things I like about Kelly's book is that she uses the metaphor of a mosaic to help us understand grief. And just like there are no two mosaics that are exactly alike, how people respond is different and particular as well. Our ways of grieving are formed by our past relationships, our ways of making meaning, one's experience of God or the divine, our history of loss, and one's sense of community and cultural perspectives. So it's different for everyone. We should never make assumptions just by looking at someone about whether or not they're actually in a period of grief or a stage of grief or grieving at all. We just have to understand that people are different, and because of our differences, we're going to grieve differently as well. So that wraps up the first part of our grief series, and we want to hear from you. You can reach us at spiritualunique.com. Tell us what you think. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. If you have any ideas or things that you would like to see or information that you would like to know about our topic today, please send us an email at spiritualunique.com. Thank you, and we look forward to hearing from you. Have a great day.